Welcome to Granny's Justice, a place where secrets are spoken and silence finally ends. My name is Evelyn Rose Carter, and if you asked anyone in my town who I was, they would tell you I was the woman who spent her entire life holding others together while slowly breaking apart inside. I was born on June 12, 1946, in a small southern town where magnolia blossoms perfumed the air and neighbors walked in
without knocking, as if every house belonged to everyone. My life began simply, with wooden floors that groaned beneath my tiny steps and a mother who whispered prayers over me each night as though I were her most fragile treasured. I grew up in a home not built of riches, but of resilience. My father, George Miller, was a carpenter whose hands bore the calluses of generations. His palms were cracked, scarred from decades of cutting and sanding wood. Yet when they wrapped around mine, I felt safer than I could have inside any palace made of gold. My mother, Clara, stitched clothes for half the town. Her sewing machine sang every day, its needle tapping, a rhythm that became the lullaby of my childhood, a song of survival, of patience, of faith that tomorrow would somehow be kinder. Our home was small, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it pulsed with warmth. On Sundays, the scent of cornbread and roasted chicken drifted into the streets, luring neighbors like bees to honey. We never had much, but we never kept what little we did have to ourselves. From the earliest days, I learned that family was not made of walls or blood alone. Family was sacrifice. Family was choosing each other again and again, no matter the cost. At 20, I married Harold Carter, a man whose quiet strength lived in his steady eyes. Eyes that seemed to hold both storms and sunshine at once. He was not wealthy, not polished, but he was unwavering. He believed in work, in prayer, in loyalty, and in promises you did not need to speak aloud to keep. Together, we rented a small brick house on the edge of town, painted our own white fence, and let roses grow wild in a garden that seemed to bloom, even when we could not afford to. Our life was far from perfect. Winters came when the firewood was scarce. Summers brought leaks that trickled through the roof. Nights fell when unpaid bills stacked higher than our hopes. Yet Harold and I faced every storm hand in hand. He never promised me the world, but what he gave me was far greater. A love that did not falter when life grew unkind. Motherhood entered my life like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. When David, my firstborn, was placed in my arms, my soul seemed to expand beyond the boundaries of my body. He had Harold's eyes, steady, piercing, and my smile. 3 years later came Samuel, smaller but fiercer, a child who cried loudly and loved even louder. I poured myself into those boys. Every night I stitched their clothes, even when my fingers bled. Every morning I cooked oatmeal and eggs, humming hymns as they rubbed the sleep from their eyes. I prayed over them before school, whispering blessings into their hair. I dreamed that they would grow into men of honor, men who would never forget the sacrifices of the mother who raised them. If you asked the neighbors, they would tell you, Evelyn was the woman whose kitchen never closed, whose hands never stopped giving, whose heart was too soft for the world. People came to me with their troubles, broken marriages, hungry children, unpaid bills. Somehow, I always found a way to share what little I had. But kindness, I would later learn, can be a weakness in the wrong hands. As my sons grew into men, life brought me. When David, my eldest, brought home his bride, I thought my family had finally become whole. I welcomed her with open arms, believing she would be the daughter I had never been given. I thought love would multiply as the family grew, but I was wrong. Terribly, painfully wrong, because sometimes the person you invite into your home does not bring love. Sometimes, they bring storms. Because sometimes, the person you welcome into your home carries not love, but storms. I did not know it then. On the morning of my eldest son's wedding, I was too full of joy to notice the quiet shadows already creeping into my life. The house smelled of fresh roses I had arranged myself, my hands trembling not from age but from happiness. I wore a lavender dress Harold once told me made me look younger, and as I stood before the mirror, I whispered, "This is the day our family becomes whole." The church was alive with voices that morning, neighbors, cousins, even strangers who came not for the couple, but for the sense of community. Small-town weddings always carried. My heart swelled when I saw David at the altar. Tall, handsome, nervous, in the same way Harold had been on our wedding day. My boy, my firstborn, was beginning his own story, and then she walked in. The woman who would soon be my daughter entered, with a grace that silenced the whispers. Her gown shimmered beneath the stained glass windows, her smile so radiant it seemed crafted to win hearts. I clutched Samuel's hand and whispered, "Look at her. Doesn't she look like an angel?" He nodded politely, but his silence lingered, heavy. I ignored it. I wanted this day to be the answer to every prayer I had ever spoken. When the ceremony ended and the church bells rang, I embraced her as though she were my own flesh and blood. "Welcome home, my dear," I whispered. Her perfume was sharp, modern, unfamiliar, so different from the lavender and cinnamon that had clung to me all my life. She kissed my cheek lightly, her eyes already searching past me for David. I brushed away the faint chill in my chest. Love only grows when shared, I told myself. The first weeks blurred into celebration. My home overflowed with guests bringing casseroles and pies, voices filling every corner. My kitchen rang with laughter, clattering dishes, the sweet chaos of family. She played her part well, serving tea, smiling politely, even calling me mother, with a softness that seemed almost genuine. I believed her, I wanted to. But slowly, small things began to shift. At dinner, David no longer asked about my day. His eyes never left her. When I suggested a recipe he had loved since boyhood, she smiled sweetly and said, "Oh, David doesn't like that anymore. His tastes have changed." I laughed at first. Tastes change, don't they? But each time it happened, I felt the circle of family tightening, the space where I once stood growing smaller. One afternoon, I found her rearranging the photographs. My wedding picture, once centered on the mantel, shoved to a corner. The painting Harold had given me replaced by a sleek silver clock. "It makes the room look more modern," she said, her voice honey but her eyes steel. David walked in, kissed her forehead, and said, "Looks perfect, perfect." For years, I had curated that home, every corner a memory, every frame a story, and in a matter of weeks, it was being rewritten. Still, I kept silent. Silence had been my shield through loneliness and hardship. Families needed time to blend, I told myself. My own mother-in-law had struggled with me once. We had found peace. Surely, history would repeat itself. But then came the first wound. It was a golden Sunday. Sunlight pouring through the curtains, the scent of fresh bread filling the house. I had spent hours preparing David's favorite meal, roasted chicken with rosemary, mashed potatoes on Harold's old china. Pride lifted my heart as I announced, "David, I made your favorite." His face lit up. But before he could speak, she laughed softly. "Oh, Evelyn, you didn't have to. David doesn't eat so heavy anymore. We're on a healthier diet." The words were simple, but the tone cut me open. David nodded. "She's right, Mom. We're cutting back." The dish that once symbolized comfort, birthdays, love, untouched. I forced a smile, hands trembling as I passed the bread basket. "Of course," I whispered, "of course." That night, when the house emptied and Samuel slept, I sat alone at the table, staring at the cold chicken. My eyes burned. How easily a lifetime of tradition could be dismissed, how quickly a mother could be replaced. But it was only the beginning. As weeks turned to months, the distance widened. David no longer lingered over coffee with me. He no longer laughed at our old family jokes. His gaze never left her. She became his son, and I, once his universe, was fading into shadow. Neighbors praised her endlessly. Such a modern woman, so graceful, so polished. I nodded, smiling tightly, swallowing the truth that pressed against my throat. They did not see the glances she cast at me when no one was looking. Glances that said, "You don't belong here anymore." The first insult came on a rainy evening. I was folding laundry, humming softly, when she entered. She picked up one of David's shirts I had ironed, smirked, and said, "You don't have to bother, Evelyn. I take care of David now." It wasn't her words, but the way she said them. As though my care was intrusion, as though a mother's love was a trespass. I wanted to speak, to remind her that before she knew his name, I had wiped his tears, bandaged his knees, prayed over his every breath, but the words froze. I folded the shirt again, and placed it neatly on the pile. That night, as thunder rolled outside, I wrote in my diary, "This is not the daughter I prayed for. This is the storm I feared." And in my heart, a silence began to grow, a silence that one day would become a storm of its own. Asterisk, they closed the diary with a soft thud. but the sentences inside would not lie down. They beat against my ribs like a pulse. I could not quiet. Outside, rain drew silver rivers down the window. Inside, I thought of every prayer I had ever folded into my palms. Prayers for peace, for the future of my children, for the quiet legacy Harold and I had tried to build. Peace, I learned, is fragile. It does not always break with thunder. Often it splinters slowly, under the weight of a whisper. The whispers began almost inaudibly at first, a tilt of the head, a smile that lingered too long, a suggestion disguised as concern. When neighbors dropped by, she would laugh and say, "Evelyn clings to old traditions. We prefer to live differently." David would smile, nod, and in that small motion my hands would clamp around the teacup until the porcelain trembled. I told myself she was young. I told myself she meant no harm, but whispers gather courage. They grow teeth. One morning I found her in the kitchen, tipping a jar of jam into the trash. "Expired," she said, as if deciding the fate of preserves were no different from deciding the fate of people. I reached out, but she pulled it away with a smile as smooth as glass. "We don't need old things cluttering the house," she added, almost kindly. Old things, the word lodged like a pebble in my throat. Had I, too, become an old thing to be cleared away? David came in then, tie slightly askew, shoulders bowed by the day. I wanted to tell him how the words shredded me. I wanted to say that this jam was made the same week that my hands had stirred it with love. But before I could gather the courage, she adjusted his tie, kissed his cheek, and said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything." And with that single breath of hers, my voice dissolved. Days folded one into another. She made choices about furniture, meals, even how the bills were paid. David followed quietly, sometimes because he trusted her, sometimes because he wanted to please her. I watched him slip farther away, thread by thread, until the boy who once hid behind my skirt was gone, replaced by a man who belonged to someone else. The first true fracture came at Sunday dinner. I had spent the day making Samuel's favorite, an apple pie done the old way. Crust browned just so, the house fragrant with cinnamon the way it always had been. Samuel returned home weary from long shifts at the factory. His face softened when he smelled the pie. "You still make it best, Mama," he said, and my heart swelled as if it might burst. But before the fork could be raised, she spoke. "Oh, Sam, you should really cut back on sweets. They're not good for your health." Her voice floated over the table like a feather, but its landing was a stone. Samuel's smile faltered. David, with an easy chuckle, said, "She's right. Sam, you don't want to end up with health problems like Dad." Harold had died from a heart condition. His absence was a raw place that never healed. To have it named casually, tossed between courses as if it were a lesson in moderation, felt like salt poured into an open wound. I searched David's face for a flicker of remorse. There was only her at the center of his world. Samuel set his fork down. "I'll eat it later, Mama," he whispered. I kept my smile. Inside, a small foundation that had held my life cracked. Not a collapse, not yet, but a fissure that would widen if ignored. That night I wrote in the diary in hands that shook with a mix of sorrow and quiet rage. "They are erasing me, piece by piece. Today, it was pie. Tomorrow, it will be my chair at the table. One day, I feared, it will be my son himself." And the fear proved not to be prophecy, but an unfortunately accurate map. The spaces between David and me became an ocean of small absences. He stopped coming by in the mornings. He stopped asking about the ache behind my knees or whether the arthritis had flared. He stopped laughing at the old family jokes that once rolled around our kitchen like good bread. His attention, his time, his tenderness, they were all spun toward her. She became the sun, around which his days turned. I orbited slowly, dimmer and dimmer. It was Samuel who finally named what was happening. One evening, he found me on the porch, shoulders rounded against the cooling air, watching the sun drown behind the trees. He sat beside me, his boots scuffed, his face older than his years. "Mama," he said softly, "she doesn't treat you right." I sighed, the breath of decades in it. "It's not my place to fight, Sam," I told him. "A mother must endure." He shook his head, stubborn as any young man. "No, Mama, a mother must be respected. That's different." His words planted a root inside me, small and uncertain at first, but alive. It took hold where my fear and my pride met, and it began to grow. The turning point came at a Sunday gathering at the church. I had knitted shawls for the older women, tiny reminders that someone remembered them. When I offered them, the women wept and hugged me, their gratitude warm and honest. But then she rose, voice smooth enough to carry across the pews. Evelyn spends so much time on little things, she should rest instead of exhausting herself. Sometimes she forgets what matters most. The room tightened, faces that had smiled turned blank. My cheeks burned. I wanted to stand and speak, to demand how dare she measure a life by convenience and call it compassion. But the words clung to the roof of my mouth. I folded them back into my chest and breathed until my pulse slowed. That night I wrote again. I am being erased in my own home. My voice, my choices, my love, all fading under her shadow. But one day I will remind them who I am. One day the silence will end. I did not yet know how, but inside me something had shifted. The quiet had become a pressure. A storm was gathering, not in the sky, but in my chest. And once it had decided to break, nothing would remain unchanged. The diary lay open before me, the ink still wet where I had pressed my pen into fragile pages. Outside, the night hummed with crickets and the world slept. But inside my chest a different sound rose, a storm louder than any summer thunder. Silence had been my armor for so many years. Now it felt like a cage, and I knew, if I lived in that hush too long, it would suffocate me. The next morning the wound deepened. I rose before the sun, fingers stiff with age, as I always did. I kneaded bread while the coffee percolated on the stove, small rituals that kept Harold alive inside the rhythm of the house. When David came into the kitchen, I set a warm cup before him, smiling because habit had taught me to hope for connection in the smallest things. He did not meet my eyes. She prefers tea, he said, glancing toward the doorway where his wife stood, immaculate and poised, a robe tied neat at her waist. I made coffee for you, I offered, voice soft as the steam curling from the cup. He shook his head. I've switched. Tea feels lighter. The cup between us steamed, but every ounce of warmth drained from me. Years of mornings, half-whispered confidences, plans, small jokes evaporated with a single sentence. She touched his arm and gently led him away, and I was left with silence and the bitter scent of cooling beans. Days collected like small, clean cuts, insignificant alone, sharp together. Then came the Sunday at Marjorie's cafe, when the wound was ripped wide open. Marjorie has been my friend for 50 years. She held me the night Harold died. She knows the exact place my laugh lives. She invited us to tea after service, as we always did. The cafe buzzed, hugs and chatter wrapping around me like a shawl. For a moment I felt whole again, until she spoke. As I told a story, Harold on the ladder, rain soaking his shirt. Laughing while I steadied the ladder and scolded him, she cut in with that practiced laugh that made people turn. Oh, Evelyn tells that story every time, she said, bright and absurd. She forgets she's already told it. Age does that, doesn't it? Her words were knives wrapped in sugar. The room stilled. Faces shifted from warmth to pity. My cheeks burned. My throat closed. For the first time in my life, I wanted the earth to swallow me whole. David gave a strained chuckle. She means no harm, Mom, he murmured, but the harm was done. I excused myself and stepped into the autumn air, which bit at my cheeks but could not reach the cold hollow growing beneath my ribs. Samuel came after me, his jaw tight, hands balled into fists by his side. Mama, he said, voice low and furious, don't let her do that. You don't deserve it. For a breath I saw Harold in Samuel, the same stubborn light, the same fierce loyalty. My hand shook as I touched my son's cheek. I have endured worse, I said. My voice broke, but this is my home, my children. He pulled me in and whispered, promise me you won't stay silent forever. That night I wrote until my hand cramped. Today she humiliated me in front of my oldest friends. Today my son laughed while my dignity was stripped away. Today a piece of me died, but something else took its place. Not bitterness, not a hollow anger, but a hard, steady resolve. The silence will not last. Closing the diary, I understood something I had not before. Endurance is not always a virtue. There is a line where patience becomes surrender, and I had crossed it too many times. The cracks in the foundation were no longer subtle. They spiderwebbed across every room, splitting the house into small, colder chambers. People would soon hear the sound of it breaking, and when the house finally gave, they would know who had been standing in the ruin, and who had let the storm in. The morning after the cafe incident, I woke with swollen eyes and a weight in my chest that would not lift. Shame clung to me like damp clothes. Harold's voice echoed in my dreams. Evelyn, don't let them erase you. I pressed my palm to my heart and answered him aloud, though only the kettle heard me. I won't. Not anymore. The house felt too quiet. The photographs on the mantel had been shifted again. My wedding picture shoved into the back, half hidden behind David and his bride's smiling faces. It was a small thing, perhaps, to someone else. To me, it was a crooked thread in a tapestry I had spent a lifetime weaving. I pulled the frame forward, dusted it with my sleeve, and placed it where it had always been. My hands trembled, not from frailty, but from a kind of fury I had kept folded and polite for far too long. She came in then, robe cinched at the waist, hair perfect, smile practiced. She glanced at the photo and smirked. That's not really our style, Evelyn. We're trying to make the house feel new. Her voice was cool. The word new landed like a deliberate cut. This home was built before you knew David's name, I said quietly, steadying my voice. These walls have my sweat in them, my blood and Harold's labor. You will not erase that. For the first time, she did not bother to be subtle. Times change, she said. People change. Maybe you should, too. David came in, at that moment, towel over his shoulder, hair damp. She turned to him with a softness meant to soothe. Don't you agree the house should reflect us now? She asked. He looked between us and, uncertain, nodded. Maybe she's right, Mom. It's our home now, too. Our home. The word struck harder than any open insult. I smiled, small and calm, but a fire stoked itself under my ribs. If they wanted to rewrite our life, they would first learn what it meant to face a woman who had weathered more than a few winters. Weeks chipped away at my place. My seat at the table slid from the head to the side. The recipes I had lived by vanished from the menu and were replaced with lighter versions whose taste I could not recognize. My suggestions were dismissed as quaint, my memory teased as failing. To the outside world, everything looked perfect. A pleasant family, a polished daughter-in-law, a devoted son. Inside, I was suffocating. Samuel saw it. He began coming around more, eyes dark with quiet fury. Mama, he said one evening, voice low, you can't let them do this. This is cruelty, not mere disrespect. I know, I said, and I won't let it continue. The breaking point came at the harvest festival. I had spent the week baking apple pies, pumpkin, pecan, recipes passed from my mother to me in a chain of flour-dusted hands. I set them on the community table with a pride that made my chest ache. She swept in behind me and, with a voice loud enough for the whole square to hear, said, "Oh, Evelyn insists on baking, even though her hands shake. It's sweet, isn't it?" Laughter rippled like cold water. David's embarrassment showed in the way he shifted his feet. He didn't defend me. Samuel's fists tightened at his sides, his jaw set so hard I could see it working beneath his skin. For a heartbeat I froze. Then I straightened, lifted my chin, and let my voice carry. "Yes, my hands shake," I said, "but those same hands raised 2 sons, buried a husband, and built a home that still stands. They have done more than hold a rolling pin. They have held the family through everything." The crowd fell quiet, her smile thinned. For the first time, I saw something other than contempt flicker in her eyes, a quick, sharp fear. That night, in the safety of my kitchen, I opened my diary and wrote, "Enough. No more writing only of pain. Tonight I begin writing of something else. Justice." I started small. I gathered every letter Harold had written, every old receipt and deed that showed the sweat behind the brick and mortar of our house. I asked Samuel for a tape recorder and began discreetly recording conversations, the careless cuts she made when David left the room, the silky half-truths she spun for guests. I listened politely at garden fences and church suppers, making friends quietly, noting details that did not add up, unpaid bills tucked behind glossy shopping catalogs, arguments with old acquaintances, thinly disguised, luxuries appearing on credit statements without explainable sources of income. Piece by piece, I built a quiet archive. It was not a revenge of noise and spectacle. It was careful, like planting bulbs in autumn for spring's bloom. Revenge, I reminded myself, is not merely fury. It is timing. It is patience disguised as submission. Magnolias wait all winter before they unfold. So would I one afternoon while tidying the study. I found documents left carelessly on a desk, overdue notices, statements with purchases that made my lungs tighten, a necklace, a weekend trip, charges for boutiques with names I did not know. David's paycheck could not possibly cover all this. She was bleeding him dry, not only of money but of his attention, his loyalty, his life. I copied the pages and slipped them into the diary beneath Harold's letters. And for the first time in months I smiled without guilt. It was not a smile of cruelty. It was the precise, quiet smile of preparation. That evening, when she mocked me for misplacing my reading glasses, I did not flinch. I looked into her eyes and said softly, "Storms may come, but even storms can be silenced." She frowned, confused, perhaps unaccustomed to the woman who now met her calmly instead of shrinking away. I turned and walked away with my head held high. My silence had changed. It was no longer surrender. It had become a plan, a slow, patient turning of a tide. When the day arrived that her masks fell and David saw the truth behind the shine, they would not remember me as the woman who faded. They would remember me as the woman who built back what they tried to take. A mother's silence may break, but her justice endures. The morning after my vow, I woke with a steadiness I had not felt in years. My bones still ached, my hands still trembled, but my heart beat with fire. Silence had been my cage for so long. Now it would be my weapon. I began quietly. When she mocked me for misplacing the salt at dinner, I smiled, excused myself, and let the small recorder in my apron capture every word. When she rolled her eyes at the neighbors and sighed, "Evelyn forgets things," I nodded politely while the tape spun unseen in my pocket. I was no longer only enduring, I was collecting. Each insult became evidence, each cruelty, a stone in the fortress I was building. Samuel noticed. One evening he found me at the kitchen table, the lamplight spilling across piles of receipts, letters, and statements. His rough hands brushed against mine. "Mama, what are you doing?" I looked up, eyes sharper than they had been in years. "Preparing." He sat down beside me, jaw tight. "Tell me how I can help." So I told him everything. I showed him the overdue bills, the hidden debts, the reckless spending. He scanned the papers, his lips pressing into a hard line. "She's ruining him," he muttered, "and he doesn't even see it." "He will," I said, "but only when the truth is too loud to ignore." The chance came at church. The pastor had invited David and his wife to join the finance committee, a position of trust and honor. During the meeting, as the congregation discussed donations for the new roof, she stood tall, speaking smoothly about budgeting, responsibility, sacrifice. Heads nodded, impressed. She looked the very picture of grace. I sat in the back pew, hands folded in my lap, listening. When the floor opened for questions, I rose. My voice was calm, but it carried responsibility. I repeated, letting the words settle over the room. "It is indeed important, especially when one has debts unpaid or spends far more than one earns." The congregation fell into silence. She turned, her eyes flashing behind a brittle smile. "Evelyn, perhaps this isn't the time, but it was. It was exactly the time." I drew a folded paper from my purse and held it high. "Overdue statements," I said clearly. "Jewelry bought on credit. Luxuries beyond measure. While this committee saves for a roof, others spend recklessly and hide it." Gasps rippled through the pews. David's face drained of color. Samuel rose at my side, his presence unyielding, his silence an anchor. "She's lying," she hissed, reaching for David's arm. But I had no need to shout. The papers spoke louder than any voice. That night the house filled with a silence, heavier than fire. David confronted me in the kitchen, his jaw set tight. "Why did you do that, Mom?" In front of everyone. I met his eyes. "Because truth does not belong in shadows, David. It belongs in the light. And one day, you will thank me for showing you what you refused to see." He stormed out, the door slamming like thunder. But Samuel remained. He touched my shoulder, steady as stone. "You did the right thing, Mama." I nodded. "This is only the beginning." The weeks that followed cracked her mask. Neighbors who had praised her now whispered doubts. Friends who had admired her elegance began questioning her honesty. David grew tense, caught between loyalty and truth. One evening, as I poured tea, I felt her eyes on me from the doorway. Hatred burned in her stare. "You think you've won," she spat, "but you're just a lonely old woman with nothing left but bitterness." I set the teapot down gently, turned, and looked her dead in the eye. My voice was low, unshaken. "No, I am a mother, and a mother's justice is stronger than your lies." Her face hardened, but I saw it, a flicker, brief as a candle guttering in the wind. Fear. And in that moment, I knew. The storm she had brought into my home was no longer breaking me, it was breaking her. That night, I wrote in my diary, "The seeds of justice have been planted. The storm has begun to shift. Soon, the world will see what I already know, that truth may be buried, but it always claws its way back to the surface. And when it does, it uproots everything in its path." I closed the diary. Candlelight flickered against the walls. shadows stretching like sentinels. The silence was no longer my prison, it was the drumbeat of war. The night after the church confrontation, sleep slipped through my fingers like water. The house felt heavy, loaded with words left unsaid. Every creak in the floor, every steady tick of the clock, seemed to remind me that I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. I had done it on purpose. I did not regret it. At dawn, I rose with a steadiness that surprised even me. Soft gold spilled through the lace curtains, and the kitchen filled with morning light. I brewed my coffee, not for David, who had traded it for tea, but for myself. The steam rose like a small victory, and for a moment I felt Harold at my shoulder, proud that I had finally stood up straight. Battles are not won with a single cry. They are won in patience and planning, in the careful placing of one stone upon another. I had learned that truth was a slow thing, like a river that wears down rock. I would let it do its work. The fallout came quickly, but not all at once. At the market that afternoon, neighbors who once smiled when she passed now glanced away, lips pressed in thin lines. Mrs. Hensley, who used to gush over her outfits, clutched her purse a little tighter. Mr. Turner's usual cheerful hello shrank to a curt nod. I watched the small shifts and felt a quiet satisfaction every time her practiced smile faltered. At home, David grew restless. He paced the halls at night, his voice rising behind closed doors as he argued in whispers with her. I pretended not to hear, but Samuel met my eye with a knowing look. The cracks were spreading. One evening, David confronted me in the living room. His face had the slack, haunted look of a man pulled two ways. "Mom," he began, voice thin, "why are you doing this? Why are you trying to tear us apart?" I set my knitting on the armchair and met his gaze. "I am not tearing you apart, David. She is. I only hold up a mirror." His eyes darkened. "You don't understand. She loves me. She takes care of me, does she?" My voice was quiet but steady. "Or does she control you? Look around, son. Whose choices are these? Whose life are you living? Yours or hers?" He faltered for a heartbeat, then shook his head as if to clear it. "You've changed, Mom. You're bitter now." "No." I stepped closer, hands steady. "I have woken up." The final straw came during the town's autumn charity drive. It was the sort of tradition Harold had loved. Neighbors gathering, old recipes shared, everyone giving what they could. When the list of donations was read aloud, I sat stunned. David and his wife had pledged an amount far beyond anything I knew he could afford. A murmur ran through the crowd. How could they promise so much when their bills were already piling up? I rose slowly, cane tapping once on the wooden floor, then twice. "Generosity built on debt is not generosity," I said plainly. "It is vanity." Gasps. All eyes turned to them. Her face flushed, a tremor running through the smile she wore for company. "Evelyn, please," she began, voice brittle. But the tide had turned. Questions that had been private spilled out in public. Neighbors exchanged worried glances. David stood there, the color gone from his face, doubt flickering in his eyes like a candle in draft. That night the house thundered with voices. "You've embarrassed me," she screamed. "You keep humiliating me in front of everyone." David's voice broke. "Why didn't you tell me about the debts? The cards?" Her silence answered him. I sat in my room while the storm raged, and though the walls shook, a small, steady smile lifted the corner of my mouth. For the first time the scales were tipping. Samuel came to my door later, boots scuffed, eyes bright with cautious triumph. "Mama, it's working. He's finally seeing." I placed my hand over his. "Patience," I said. "Truth is a river. It moves slow, but it always reaches the sea." I laid the folder I had built between us, receipts, recorded conversations, testimonies from neighbors whose suspicions had been quietly gathered. Each page in that folder was a careful strike. Names, dates, charges, promises. Each recorded phrase was a soundbite that could not be spun into charm. They were not weapons of malice. They were instruments of honesty, ready to cut through the glamour she had wrapped herself in. "When the time comes," I told Samuel, "we will use this, not to ruin for the sake of ruin, but to restore. He must see the truth, not the version she sold him." The next Sunday I walked into church with my head held high. The whispers that followed were different. Not pity, but something like respect. People had watched carefully. When I knelt to pray, I did not ask for peace so much as for strength. The strength to finish what I had begun. The storm, I realized, was no longer simply outside my door. It was in my hands now, patient and inevitable. I held the evidence, the memories, the quiet loyalty of those who had not yet been convinced. I held Samuel's steady presence. I held Harold's letters and every ordinary, stubborn thing that made up our life. Soon the river would reach the sea, and when it did, everything that had been built on sand would wash away. The night after my prayer in church, I lay awake, watching the ceiling in the dim light, listening to the old clock in the hall count the seconds like a metronome toward what I had planned. Tick-tock. Each sound felt like a step closer to the moment I would no longer wait. My fear had been replaced by something colder and truer resolve. My heart no longer trembled. It beat with purpose. I had collected enough to undo her carefully woven story. Receipts, statements, snippets of conversations, neighbors' memories stitched together into a single, undeniable truth. But truth by itself is not always enough. It must be revealed on the right stage, in the right way, before the right witnesses. Revenge, if you must call it that, is a performance of justice, and I chose my stage with care. That stage came sooner than I expected. The town's annual Thanksgiving banquet was held in the old community hall, where families set long tables and neighbors shared plates and speeches. It was a ceremony of gratitude, a place where appearances mattered and reputations were on parade. David and his wife were asked to speak that year, symbols of the modern family everyone admired. She took the podium with the practiced ease of someone used to being adored. Her voice rang clear and confident as she spoke about sacrifice, duty, and the blessings of giving. Heads nodded, hands applauded, and the hall drank her polish as if it were gospel. I could not stand aside. I rose slowly, the cane tapping once, twice, on the wooden floor. Conversations folded into a hush as people turned. There I stood, the widow they'd pitied, the woman they thought had been diminished, and I let my voice carry. Sacrifice, I said, letting the single word hang in the air. It is a noble thing, but what is sacrifice when it is only a story used to cover debt and deception? A ripple went through the crowd. Her smile faltered. I reached into my bag, my hands steady though they trembled in memory, and drew out the folder I had tucked together like a secret harvest. Here, I said, are the bills behind the speeches. Here are the purchases, the overdue statements, the proofs of a life made to look generous while being built on credit. I handed the papers to the pastor. He read, brow furrowing. A murmur swelled to a hum, then to a growing chorus of disbelief. Faces in the hall shifted from reverence to suspicion. The gilding on her reputation flaked away under the light. She lunged, voice sharp and shrill. She's lying. She's jealous. She's bitter. But her words thinned, losing power, the moment Samuel stepped forward. No, Samuel said, his voice low and fierce. She's telling the truth. I've seen it with my own eyes. I have watched her drain my brother and mock the woman who raised us. This ends now. When he spoke, the room stilled. David stood like a man trapped by the wind, pale and unsteady. The pastor handed the papers back to David. His fingers shook as he read. Each line washed color from his face. The arithmetic of betrayal does not negotiate, it reveals. Is this true? He asked, voice small and bewildered, looking to the woman he had trusted. She faltered, words failing. I only wanted us to have more, she stammered. I did what I thought was best. A life built on lies. David's voice snapped like a thread. On debts. On tearing my mother down piece by piece. The mask she had worn so carefully shattered into pieces. She screamed the sound of panic, not fury, and lunged toward me. David caught her arm. No longer a child but a man provoked into hard clarity. Enough, he bellowed. You have poisoned this family long enough. The room watched, stunned. Some faces shaded with pity for a fallen idol. Others held the grim satisfaction of justice finally served. Tears filled David's eyes as he turned toward me. Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have listened. My chest tightened at the rawness of it, but I kept my face steady. The truth finds its way. Son, I said softly, it can be buried, but not dead. You will forgive yourself in time. What followed was swift and merciless. Her reputation unspooled in public. Neighbors, who once praised her, crossed the street to avoid meeting her glance. Friends withdrew their favors. Creditors began calling with the polite cruelty of collectors. David, shocked and contrite, retreated into the quiet rhythms we had once known. Back to the kitchen, back to the slow honesty of our everyday. He moved through the house like a man learning his geography again, searching for landmarks he had ignored. One evening, months after the banquet, Samuel and I sat on the porch while the sun folded itself behind the trees. The evening was warm with the last light of day. David approached, shoulders heavy, eyes rimmed with fatigue and sorrow. He knelt beside me, the same way he had knelt as a boy when he wanted a blessing. "Can you forgive me?" he whispered. I placed my hand on his bowed head the way Harold once had placed his, gentle and certain. "Forgiveness is not simple," I said. "It is not forgetting, but a mother's heart makes room. I will forgive you, because you are my son. We will mend what is broken." He wept, the sound small and human, and for the first time in years I felt the weight lift from my chest. That night I opened the diary one last time. I wrote slowly, each word a settling of stones. "The storm has passed." She tried to erase me, but she erased herself. My silence was not weakness. It was a weapon honed by patience. Justice came not with a shout but with careful truth. I have taken back what was mine, my dignity, my voice, my place. The scars remain. They are the map of survival. I endured, and I prevailed. I closed the diary and set down my pen. The house felt different in that quiet, not empty, but altered, rearranged by what had happened. The silence that once caged me now felt like a victory lap, steady, wide, full of space. Justice had arrived late, but it had arrived, and when it finally did, it was as simple and terrible as the truth itself. The days after the banquet felt like dawn after a long, dark night. For the first time in years, I walked through town with my chin lifted instead of bowed. Neighbors who once offered pity now stopped to clasp my hand. "You were brave, Evelyn," Mrs. Hensley murmured at the market, eyes glossy. "You reminded us that truth matters." The words warmed me, but I kept them small. Gratitude can be as fragile as glass, and I did not want to polish pride into a crack. Respect returned slowly, awkwardly, like a shy visitor reclaiming an old room. The same community that had once been dazzled by a smooth smile now turned toward me with gratitude, curiosity, and, in some faces, a new awe. Still, I guarded myself. Admiration is whether it shifts. What mattered most was not how they spoke of me but how I held myself when no one was watching. David moved through the days quieter, humbled in a way that made him painfully human again. Gone were the careless laughs and the brittle swagger. He came to sit on the porch with me more often, the two of us watching the fields as if searching for pieces of himself he hadn't known were missing. One evening, when crickets stitched the air, he turned to me with an honesty that felt like confession. "Mom, I don't know how to rebuild from here," he said. I laid my hand over his. "Start with honesty," I told him. "With yourself, with others, with me. Lies are easy, son. They rot the heart. Truth is heavy, but it steadies you." His face softened, tears at the edges. For a long, bright moment I saw the boy who had once clung to my skirts, the boy who trusted me with every secret. It made my chest ache in the best way. Samuel, steady as ever, stood taller through the whole thing. "Mama," he said one night, voice low and certain, "you taught us strength, but this was more. You showed me that silence, when used wisely, can be stronger than any shout." I smiled the way you do when someone finally understands the meaning of an old lesson. "Strength doesn't always roar, Sam," I replied. "Sometimes it waits, and when it moves, it does not miss." She who had torn at our life did not vanish into thin air. For weeks she clawed and spun new tales, blaming me, blaming David, even blaming the town. But the evidence had weight. The fabric of her lies could not hold. Creditors called with the polite cruelty of business. Friends withdrew like flowers taken indoors before frost. And slowly she receded into the small, bitter world she had carved for herself. Her voice, which had commanded rooms, grew thin and distant. I did not take pleasure in her undoing. The point had never been to watch her fall, but to reclaim what was mine, my dignity, my voice, my place at the table. That reclamation felt quieter, truer. In the evenings the house began to smell of bread and cinnamon again instead of smoke and hurt. David relearned the rituals of home. He helped with dishes. He laughed softly at old jokes. He shared the small news of his day. The table, scarred but sturdy, sat under our hands like an old friend. Scars, of course, remained. At odd hours I would feel a sting of humiliation, the old ache that comes from betrayal. Justice does not erase pain. It gives pain a reason. Some nights I would open the diary and run my fingers over my old lines, feeling how each entry had been part confession, part map, part prayer. Samuel watched me once from the porch and asked, "Will you keep writing, Mama?" I closed the book and looked at that worn cover, at the ink that had been my companion through storm and quiet. "No," I said, and the word surprised even me. "This chapter is closed. The silence that filled these pages has found its voice, gently." I set the diary on the shelf beside Harold's letters, not hidden, but honored. It belonged there, a testament rather than a wound. As the sun drifted low and painted the fields gold and crimson, I offered a prayer. Not for vengeance or for victory, but for what I had wanted all along. Peace. Peace in my home. Peace in my sons. Peace in myself. I had learned that silence could wound, but it could also heal. That storms could destroy, but they could also wash clean. I bore my scars without shame. They were proof that I had endured, that I had refused to be erased. I am Evelyn Rose Carter, a mother, a survivor, a woman whose silence broke into justice, and my story, though marked and tempered by pain, was mine again. The weeks after I shut the diary felt different in every small way. The house no longer echoed with clipped laughter or cutting words. The silence that filled the rooms now was not the hush of fear or erasure, but the quiet of something healed, steady, ordinary, true. David changed, slowly, and with the awkwardness of a man relearning his own hands. He lingered at the table after meals, stayed for the second cup of coffee, and listened when I spoke instead of answering out of habit. He no longer parried my memories with excuses or defended the woman who had driven a wedge between us. He sat on the porch beside me and watched the fields, as if searching for pieces of himself he had misplaced. One evening, when the crickets stitched the air, he turned to me with a shame I could see in the bend of his shoulders. "Mom," he said, voice tight, "I don't deserve your forgiveness." I put my hand over his and felt the tremor of a son who had finally learned the weight of what he'd lost. "You don't have to deserve it, David," I told him. "You only have to learn from it. Family is stubborn that way. It hurts, and then it tries to heal." Samuel remained my steady anchor through it all. We repaired the house together, repainting walls, polishing frames, returning Harold's photograph to the center of the mantel where it belonged. With each small ritual we reclaimed a piece of ourselves, the scent of fresh bread in the morning, the clink of old china at dinner, the easy laughter that comes when people stop guarding their words. Samuel would stand in the doorway, watching until the light softened, and then say, "Mama, you showed us how to be quiet and strong." That was brave. I only smiled. Strength, I had learned, does not always make noise. As for her, she drifted out of our lives like smoke. The creditors called with the bluntness of business. Neighbors who had once admired her charm now avoided her path. The stories she spun grew thinner under the weight of facts. Friends retreated as the truth left no space for the image she had crafted. I did not take pleasure in her undoing. The point was never to watch someone fall. It was to lift what had been stolen. My dignity, my voice, my place at the table. We rebuilt more than rooms. We rebuilt trust. Day by day, spoonful by spoonful, David learned to listen. Samuel learned how fierce quiet could be. I learned that patience, wielded with intent, becomes a kind of justice, not loud or vengeful, but precise and lasting. There were still scars. On certain nights I felt the hollow ache betrayal leaves behind a sting when I passed the mantle, a memory that rose like smoke from the past. Justice did not remove that ache, it simply made it meaningful. The wounds were reminders that I had stood, that I had refused to be erased. One dusk, with the sky a spilled watercolor of gold and blood orange, I lit a candle beside Harold's photograph. The flame trembled and then steadied, casting soft light over the room. I whispered to the quiet, "We did it." They tried to silence me, but I found my voice. They tried to erase me, but I endured. The flame flickered as if in answer, and for the first time in a long while the shadows felt like guardians rather than ghosts. I set the diary on the shelf beside Harold's letters. It was no longer a book of wounds, but a ledger of how a woman who had been pushed into silence learned to shape that silence into something strong. I would not keep writing the kind of pages it held. That chapter was closed. The silence that once filled it had finally found its voice. If you ask me who I am now, I will tell you plainly. I am Evelyn Rose Carter, a mother who loved fiercely, a widow who endured, a woman who turned silence into justice and made a life whole again. The storms came, but they did not break me. They washed clean what needed cleansing and left me standing. If Evelyn's story touched you, if her quiet courage stirred something in you, don't let that voice fade into the night. Hit like if her strength moved you. Share this story with someone who needs to know that silence can be a weapon and a shelter. And subscribe for more true, small stories of people who stood up, spoke out, and reclaimed what was theirs.